if they're willing to eat an early dinner, that would be my top recommendation, 5 or 6 p.m.
Okay.
Or if you're willing to do earlier, awesome. If you're not, don't worry about it. So if you're willing to do early time restricted eating, you're probably getting the most benefits. That said, for most people, it's not practical. You have to eat dinner at a certain time of day. So my second recommendation, if you're able to do it, is to eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. So that allows you to keep your current meal times, but still get a lot of the benefits.
Hey, everybody. We've had some of the most incredible guests coming to you these past couple of months. The amount of expertise and knowledge on these cutting edge topics is something we really hope that you enjoy. And if you do, it would make a huge difference to us if you could rate, review, and subscribe the podcast. It helps us to get more guests, better experts, and talk about all of the things that are really important to you. So give us a love, give us a lot of love, and don't forget to subscribe so you get all our new episodes. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Thick Thighs Save Lives podcast. I'm Rachel, and I have a seriously, she's a guest that I think has been really, it's just, you guys have been asking for it, and we've been waiting for the right person. And Courtney Peterson is the right person to talk about a topic that you guys have been asking us about for years now. I want to let you guys know a little bit about Dr. Courtney Peterson because she is an internationally recognized researcher in the field of intermittent fasting. We didn't just get anybody for you guys. We are serious about giving you guys the best information. So we got you the best. So welcome, Courtney, to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Your research has been groundbreaking on this topic. And I said this to you before the podcast, like we didn't just get somebody who read the research. We got somebody who led the research. Like
Correct. Yeah.
you are doing the work in the field, and it's just so impressive what you have been able to do. Your research focuses on daily intermittent fasting, and also time restricted eating, which you are conducting the first controlled feeding trial of intermittent fasting in humans, and was the first to test the early timed restricted eatings, which is something that you're particularly passionate about.
Yes, absolutely.
And right now, correct me if I'm wrong, are you leading 7 clinical trials right now?
In total, the number of clinical trials we've either done in my lab or have ongoing in my lab is 7. So, and then I also serve as a consultant on another 5 or 6 clinical trials. So, just a little bit as a background. So, I run one of the largest research labs on intermittent fasting in the lab, at least measured by total, grant dollars. And they're a small but tight knit group of us intermittent fasting researchers. So, intermittent fasting has now become the third most popular diet for nutrition researchers to study. So that makes things really exciting. And then the science is really rich now, too.
I love the opportunity to deep dive into some of the science because, as you know, we have seen lots of diets come and go. And we have been told that it was the one. It is the one.
Yeah.
And a few years later, it's all of a sudden not the one anymore.
Yeah.
And so I want to just highlight the importance of your research to our listeners because it's been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Good Morning America, and Scientific American, just to name a few. So your studies are industry leading. And I just, first of all, want to put out there what an incredible woman and scientist you are in the field.
That's so nice of you.
And also just really praise, the intense work that you're doing on this topic because the health benefits are really exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of studies we do in my lab are quite challenging, but we have studies in my lab ranging in patients with type 2 diabetes, to patients with cancer, to just people who are simply looking to lose weight, to people who want to slow the aging process. So we can go anywhere and everywhere in talking about intermittent fasting today.
That's really, really exciting. To start out, I just want to ask you a sort of personal question because, as such an accomplished researcher and doctor, why food of all things? Like, why, what sparked your interest to dedicate your career to studying how humans metabolize food?
Yeah, such a great question. So, ultimately, I think a lot of us in life we're searching for a purpose where we're giving back to the world. For me, one of the things that motivates me is certainly health. But there's if you look at data on what are the leading causes of death worldwide, the number one cause of death worldwide is actually a poor diet, and that's even after you kind of subtract off malnutrition. So it's things like insufficient fruits and vegetables, whole grains, ultra processed foods, which have now become a hot topic. So this is leading cause of death. And so when I thought about where can I apply my talents and help the most people, I looked around and had always been passionate about nutrition, but a couple decades ago there were very few people doing nutrition research. And I just thought it had such potential to reverse chronic disease. And so a lot of my lab, we're actually interested not only in intermittent fasting, but diet quality, but most of my funding, grant funding is on intermittent fasting. We're kind of interested in really simple questions like, can you take someone with a chronic disease and can you either treat the disease or can you potentially reverse it? And if you can reverse it, what are the conditions under which you can reverse it? So we're really interested in particular, can we lower people's blood sugar if they have type 2 diabetes? Can we reduce their reliance on medications? Can we even put them in remission? So those are the kinds of things that help me to get up in the morning and do the sort of, hard work that we do here.
Well, yeah. I mean, when searching for your life's purpose, taking on the number one cause of death worldwide is certainly that's you're going for it. That's like purpose on 10.
Yeah.
So, that's I so applaud your all of the work that you do and your passion for this because ultimately it does have, you know, in your forefront, in your mind is really just the idea of helping people to live longer and better. And
Yeah.
that's just, I don't know if there is a better goal.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of wonderful goals, but this is the one that, gets me really excited, to roll up my sleeves. So.
So we aren't big fans of fad diets, and we admittedly have steered a little bit clear of talking about intermittent fasting because it sort of entered the scene with some of the fad diets at the time and was being used as sort of a weight loss above all kind of way of eating. And we do a lot of work with our community on sort of unlearning these disordered eating habits and unlearning some of these disordered thoughts around food. And I want to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners why your research on time restricted eating is different from all of the other fad diets they've been exposed to over the years.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to start even with some basics. What is intermittent fasting? So it's kind of funny, actually, because even within the scientific community, I'll have people come up to me who think intermittent fasting is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It can do no wrong. It cures all evils. And then other folks who think there's absolutely nothing here. And the truth is somewhere in between, as with all things. But the exciting thing is we're starting to get a lot of data. So we're starting to understand exactly what intermittent fasting is good for and how big of those effects on your health. So just to start at the basics, so intermittent fasting is any sort of meal timing approach where you alternate periods of eating and extended fasting. And I recently sat on an international consensus committee of about 35 experts in the space of fasting and intermittent fasting. And so we now define intermittent fasting as you need to be fasting for at least 14 hours at a time. and then you repeat that at some sort of periodic basis. Um, we use intermittent fasting. We often assume that term describes a particular type of intermittent fasting, but there are actually a lot of different intermittent fasting approaches. And then there are even some approaches that are hugely popular, for instance, in Europe or in Asian countries that almost no one does in the US, or much fewer people do in the US. But just to give you a flavor of what's out there. So when I like to think of all the different types of intermittent fasting, I like to group them into three broad groups. So your sort of first group of intermittent fasting approaches I call periodic fasting. So these are approaches where you have a water only fast. So you drink, eat or drink nothing but water for 24 hours at a time, and you repeat that on some sort of periodic basis. So examples of that would be fasting 1 day a week, which is popular in a number of religious traditions. Another example would be alternate day fasting, where every other day you have a complete water only fast. That's pretty extreme. And the interesting thing about that approach, there have been some scientific studies on that. They generally find that people can't stick to that approach. So it's really sort of not a sustainable approach in the long term. There are a small number of people who have severe obesity who might benefit from it, but we generally don't think this is something where we're going to go out and tell the public you should do alternate day fasting. um, and then there are other approaches where you do something called a modified fast. And so typically what that means is you're eating a very low calorie diet that's about the equivalent of one meal per day. And so examples of that would be alternate day modified fasting. So every other day you eat the equivalent of one meal on that day, and you still get a lot of those sort of fasting benefits. Another example would be the 5-2 diet, which is very popular in the United Kingdom. And this is where you pick 2 days a week, either consecutive or non consecutive, to eat a very low calorie diet. Another example would be the fasting mimicking diet, which has become pretty popular. This approach was developed by Walter Longo because he was trying to use fasting to treat cancer patients, and found most cancer patients don't want to have water only fasts, for 2 days at a time prior to chemotherapy. And so he developed this fast where you eat a plant based, low calorie diet for 3 to 5 days in a row, and then just repeat that on a periodic basis. So that kind of gives you a flavor of two of those categories of approaches. And then the third category of approach, the one that I think most people think about when I say intermittent fasting, are your daily intermittent fasting approaches, which are now known as time restricted eating when you're talking about humans, or time restricted feeding when you're talking about animals. And these are the approaches that I think are most sustainable. They're the least extreme, and where I think they're probably, the most benefits for most people. And in these approaches, you basically compress all your eating in a shorter time period each day. And you can do that either by moving breakfast later in the day and or dinner earlier in the day. And we can talk a little bit about the timing of the windows. But the really nice thing about these time restricted eating approaches, there's not a specific calorie target you need to hit. So you can either cut your calories or not if you want. Um, and then they're much more customizable. I feel like they're more adaptable. You don't have to reserve a whole day where you're only going to eat one meal, or where you're only going to have water only fasting. And so very rapidly, time restricted eating, or TRE, has become sort of the predominant, type of intermittent fasting, not only that most people are doing, but that most researchers are studying. And some of the original research on this really dates back to a study in rodents in 2012 out of Sachin Panda's lab at the Salk Institute, where he had rodents either, kind of graze throughout the day, which, I don't know when you all grew up, but, 80s and 90s, grazing throughout the day was all the rage. Everyone said, oh, you need to graze throughout the day to keep your metabolism revved up. And it turns out, when researchers actually ran a lot of the studies, there's really no benefit to eating lots of small meals throughout the day. It's not actually necessarily bad, but there's really, really no benefit to it. But he compared eating lots of small meals, well, actually just grazing throughout the day versus eating in an 8-hour window. So in these rodents, and the amazing thing is the rodents gain significantly less weight by doing the intermittent fasting. They also had lower blood sugar levels, lower levels of inflammation. Athletically, they were more capable on all these sort of, athletic tests that you give these rodents. and their metabolism. They had beautiful circadian rhythms, and then their metabolism just worked better in so many ways. And then they had less fat in the liver. And so that was actually a milestone sort of development in the field. And what's super fascinating is this work on intermittent fasting actually came from two separate research fields. One is the sort of study of circadian rhythms. We call that chronobiology, but it's, the study of these 24-hour rhythms in your body. And then sort of independently, and probably started much earlier, the field of metabolism has been interested in intermittent fasting. And a lot of this research kind of came from um, work. It actually kind of stemmed from work on calorie restriction, which is just a fancy term we use for sort of a more aggressive weight loss program where people typically cut their calories by about 25%. So back in the 1930s, we did some of the first studies. They found that if you actually calorically restrict rodents, have them eat, much less food than they need, it actually extends their lifespan, and quite profoundly. So the animals live much longer. And fast forward a few decades, and a small number of researchers started realizing, hey, when we're, calorically restricting these rodents, they're so hungry, they're eating all their food in a short period of time. They're actually doing fasting. They're fasting for a longer time period each day. And then in 2003, Mark Mattson, who was originally considered the father of the field of intermittent fasting research, and his postdoc, Mike Anson, got into a debate about whether the life extending benefits of calorie restriction were due to the animals eating less or due to the longer fasting period they had each day. And they did a little study, and they found out that actually it looks like some of the benefits, at least on improving blood sugar and improving brain health, were actually due to the fasting period, not eating less. And then more recently, in the last 4 years, I'll just jump to where we are in the field. We now know that some of the life extending benefits of calorie restriction are not due to eating less, but they're due to having that longer daily fasting period. And we've been able to show that some of that is due to the fact that intermittent fasting increases something called autophagy, which is just kind of like cellular recycling of wastes in the body, and particularly sort of protein waste. And if you sort of block the cell's ability to do this recycling, you don't get life extending benefits. And so what we know now is time restricted eating, at least in rodents, it does extend lifespan. And it does so by basically sort of increasing this rejuvenation program in the body. So that kind of fast forwards us to today. There have now been over 100 studies on time restricted eating in people. Now, the interesting thing is the quality of the research. It's a mixed bag. A lot of these studies are really small. And so that's the kicker. Now, when we first started testing time restricted eating in humans, what we noticed is that when people ate in, say, an 8-hour window, they tended to spontaneously lose weight. And that was despite the fact that we weren't telling them, like, hey, why don't you change what you're eating or eat a little bit less? They just naturally ate less, and they typically lost about 1% to 4% of their body weight. And so then people got really excited. Oh my goodness, people are losing weight with time restricted eating. And so we've now, gosh, we've probably had over 50 studies testing 8-hour windows for weight loss. And when you look at the data as a whole, and you do something called a meta-analysis, where you just kind of like you take all the results from all the studies, combine them together, and you say, oh, does time restricted eating help people lose weight or not? And the answer is it does. And so the last few meta-analyses have all found that time restricted eating does help people lose weight. So to all your listeners and viewers, yes, we do know now that intermittent fasting does cause you to lose weight, and that's very helpful. Now, the effects are not miraculous. So here's the big asterisk. So the effects appear to be moderate. And my lab did some of the first research trying to figure out, like, okay, but how big are these effects? So we did a study in patients with obesity who wanted to lose weight. And what we did is we kind of measured their weight every 2 weeks while they were losing weight. And then we used some mathematics, and we were able to figure out, okay, how many calories is this equivalent to cutting? And we found it's equivalent to cutting about 250 calories a day.
Eating within the 8 hours.
Correct. Eating
Okay.
within 8 hours. Yep.
Okay.
And that's pretty similar to what we're seeing in these meta analyses. And there was a big study that just came out, I think just a week or two ago in Nature Medicine, and they found something similar. It was a 200-person study, which is a large study. And they found similarly time restricted eating, an 8 hour time restricted eating window, regardless of the time of day that you eat, does help people lose weight. And the effect is, again, about 250 calories a day. So the exciting thing now is like we have, I think, clear evidence that it helps you lose weight, but it's not going to be as effective, for instance, as a weight loss medication, right? For those weight loss medications, the Ozempics of the world, you're going to lose far more weight more rapidly. Now, the big con of those medications is you lose a lot of muscle mass. And then a small number of people have side effects, like they have problems ultimately with their digestive system. Because one of the ways that these weight loss medications work is they actually slow down the digestion of food in your GI tract. But some people don't respond well to that, and they get sort of permanent side effects, where their body starts struggling to move food through. Um, but I think the exciting thing is we now have clear evidence that helps people lose weight. Now, it's probably less effective than sitting down and doing meal planning and, deciding, oh, I'm going to cut my calories by 20 to 25% a day. I mean, the effects we're seeing it's about a 10% reduction in total calories. And I'll sort of pause there to see if you have any follow-up questions, but then we can also talk about other aspects
I
of it
I
too.
wanted to ask if the 200 to 250 calories that is averaging people are taking in less by
Yes.
eating in an 8-hour window, is that due to like it's actually being measured that they're taking in less, or is it metabolically some kind of extra, I hate saying this, but quote unquote burn,
Yeah.
metabolically, that they are using 200 to 250 more calories?
Yeah, great question. So my lab did a study on this a few years ago. So we put people in what's called a respiratory chamber, and we measured how many calories they were burning. So when you lose weight, pretty much there are roughly only two ways to lose weight. You either have to burn more calories or you have to eat less. And so we thought, oh, this is interesting. I wonder if intermittent fasting helps you magically burn more calories. And we found it absolutely does not. Or at least if it is, it's such a small effect that we couldn't measure it in our study. Um, and now, based on work that we've done and other investigators have done, pretty universally, all the studies have concluded it helps you eat less. So people are eating less. We've measured some of the key hunger hormones, like ghrelin is a hormone that makes you hungry. We've also measured a satiety hormone called PYY, and we do find that time restricted eating favorably affects those hormones. So we do see that as like naturally lowering your hunger. It's not just so one of the questions I feel some researchers thought, oh, maybe it's just because there's the simple rule, which I kind of like it, simple rule, eat, don't eat, that maybe people just aren't snacking, and which and that's why they're losing weight. And honestly, if that were true, that's great. Like if we're preventing snacking and that's the only way this works, wonderful. Um, and I suspect that's part of it, but that's not really what we see in the data. What we see is we do actually see these direct effects on hunger. So there's some sort of balancing of hunger. So it is directly affecting some of these hunger hormones. We don't yet understand why it affects the hunger hormones or all the steps in that process, but we do see these favorable results. And then the other thing we found is in one of our studies, we put what are called continuous glucose monitors on people. So this measures people's blood sugar. And the really interesting thing we found is with time restricted eating, people's blood sugar is more even keeled. So you don't get these huge spikes in blood sugar and then these crashes in blood sugar. It's just much more stable. And the interesting thing we know is when you get these spikes and then crashes in blood sugar, that does trigger some of the hunger hormones. So maybe some of the effects are that we're keeping people's blood sugar levels more even keeled throughout the day. And as a result, that triggers less hunger. So that could be one possibility to explain all this.
Quick interruption to remind you that our limitless dresses are live. And if you ain't doing summer in a limitless dress, I'm telling you, it is for everything. If you're a pickleball girl, if you're a tennis girl, if you are a walking around at a festival girl, you are going to look so put together, so stinking cute. You are not getting naked to go pee. No, not that's not for you. If you're at a concert, we don't want you naked in the stall. We have a easy access bathroom. We've got a built-in bra. They are the cutest patterns this year. So get yourself a limitless dress and just go around crushing everything you do. You're going to look amazing. I think there's been a lot of questions metabolically if there is something changing with regards to longer periods of fasting. And I think that it's really interesting that it seems to be more of a behavioral tool
Yeah.
than it is a metabolic tool, which is I'm very fascinated by that.
Yeah, I think it's both, if
Yeah.
that's helpful. And part of the reason why I think it's both a behavioral tool and it sort of fixes your metabolism, so to speak, and I'm using, lay terms here, but fixes your metabolism are my lab, one of the big questions that I'm really an expert in is, does intermittent fasting have benefits even if you don't lose weight? Which is such a big question in the field, right? And so, I mean, you could say, well, intermittent fasting is just a fancy way to eat less, but there's nothing special here. Let's move on, and this is one of a million tools. But there's several reasons to think that's not the case, that there is something special metabolically in addition to behaviorally. So, one of the first studies we did is we took men who had prediabetes and we did what's called a controlled feeding study, which is just a study in which you feed participants everything they need, so they only eat the food that you serve them. And so we had them try two eating schedules. We gave them a 6 hour time restricted eating window to follow that was early in the day. So this is a little bit on the more extreme end. I recommend more like an 8 hour window for most people. And we also had them try eating all their food in a 12-hour window. And they tried both and they ate the exact same food. And we actually video recorded them eating the food. So we knew that they were actually doing what they were supposed to be doing. And before and after, we measured their blood sugar, their blood pressure, and a bunch of other things related to their metabolism. And what we found is their insulin sensitivity, which is um, everyone sort of has a blood sugar hormone called insulin. And insulin's job is to move, one of its jobs is to move sugar out of your bloodstream and into your cells. And when you have blood sugar problems, what happens is that insulin molecule really struggles to do its job. It's just not efficient at moving sugar out of your bloodstream. And what we found is after about 5 weeks of eating in a 6 hour TRE window, participants, their insulin sensitivity was way better. Their insulin molecule was much better at moving sugar out of their bloodstream. And then also their beta cell function, which means the ability of the beta cell to make insulin, got better too. And that's one of the other things that's a problem once you have type 2 diabetes. So we found that the pancreas was able to kind of, make this insulin much faster and release it in your bloodstream, which is also a good thing. That's the kind of thing we want to see. And we achieved all this with absolutely no weight loss and no differences in what food they were eating. So we do think there is something special about metabolism. And then there are other effects that are sort of not really, metabolic effects, but other beneficial effects. So we also found, and quite to our surprise, a really large improvement in blood pressure. So it's about a 10 point drop, which is on par with what we see from, blood pressure lowering medications, which is huge. And we think by having this extended fasting period, that may give the body more time to rejuvenate and repair and get rid of excess sodium in the bloodstream. And so that may lower blood pressure. So we think there are actually a bunch of different things happen, and it's not just a single pathway involving insulin, but we think there are a bunch of beneficial things in the body. And then the last piece of evidence I want to quickly sneak in is one of the studies finding that TRE extended lifespan in animals. There were no differences in body weight between the control group and the group that did TRE, but they still found an extension to lifespan. So when I just put everything together, it seems like there are some benefits independent of behavior. So now the big question in the field is, do those benefits depend on the length of the fasting period? Do they depend on the time of day of the eating period? And there is some evidence suggesting that earlier in the day is better, which is another, sort of area of my expertise. So when we looked at the literature, it looked like generally when eating windows ended by 6 p.m., those studies tended to report more benefits with blood sugar and blood pressure, whereas studies where the eating windows ended a little bit later at night did not. And we can jump a little bit into that, but I wanted to pause.
Yeah, no, I definitely have some questions around that because the way in which a lot of people have in my experience have used intermittent fasting is the big fast in the morning, sort
Yes.
of pushing everything and then their first eating window being sometime around noon or 1 and then that starting the sort of 8-hour eating period. And I know that you have some thoughts on that. And, we have looked at a lot of studies, on breakfast
Mhm.
and its effects on metabolism and the way in which your body is functioning and performing during the day and those big spikes in blood sugar
Right.
that you were talking about that intermittent fasting is sort of leveling off. So I definitely wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that sort of typical morning fast that we're being sort of toted and maybe talk a little bit about your research in the early time restricting, pushing up some of those windows to include breakfast, and how should we be thinking about intermittent fasting with regards to early morning eating?
Yeah, great. All great questions. So, what's really interesting when I first started doing my research on time restricted eating, I was also sort of becoming aware of research in the field of circadian rhythms. So, just as a little bit of backstory, so circadian rhythms are these 24-hour rhythms in your physiology, metabolism, behavior. And it basically just means your body's better at doing different things at different times of the day. So, to give some examples, your best sports performance in most people is in the afternoon. That's when you have your greatest coordination, your greatest muscular strength, and your fastest reaction times. Conversely, in men, they have their highest testosterone production in the morning. In men and women, that's when you have your fastest increase in blood pressure. And it's also, in most people, the time of day that you have your best blood sugar control. And in fact, when we first were kind of developing the test to test for type 2 diabetes, they discovered back in the late 1960s, early 1970s that most people have their best blood sugar control in the morning. But at the time, we hadn't even discovered the circadian system. So it was more like a curiosity. And fast forward in the mid 90s, we started discovering more about the circadian system. And then 2017, we had the awarding of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the circadian system. But what we know now is in most people, with clear exceptions, right? So people who do overnight shift work, this is not true for. And then for complicated reasons, it's not true for people who have type 2 diabetes. But for most individuals, if you gave them a blood sugar test in the morning, afternoon, and the evening, their blood sugar levels will spike much higher in the afternoon and the evening, even though you're giving them the same sort of amount of sugar in these blood sugar tests. And so what that means is if you were to eat the same food in the morning, afternoon, and evening, your blood sugar levels will be lowest in the morning and highest in the evening. So
That's bizarre.
yep, yep. And
Same food,
same food, different
same
effect,
body,
same body.
different
And
time.
yep, different time. And the other interesting thing is the effect of processed foods is particularly worse in the evening. So if you eat the same processed food in the morning versus the evening and the afternoon, you're going to get like even much bigger spikes later in the day if you're eating, sort of what you might think of as junk food. And then there are other things we now know too, that you burn slightly more calories when you eat and digest your food in the morning. It's not a big effect. It's few squares or bites of an apple, but it's there, and that kind of suggests that for most people, maybe the morning is the best time of day to eat. And it's sort of the mid to late morning, and there have been lots of researchers that have found the same thing over and over again. So we're very confident about that. So this kind of suggests that eating earlier in the day is better. Oh, and one more finding in this area too. People who have looked at fat burning also find that it is more efficient when you eat earlier in the day as opposed to later in the day. So again, pointing towards the mornings for it being optimal for eating food. Now, the fascinating thing is breakfast, whether to eat breakfast or not, has been controversial. And the way I like to think about this is I think we're assuming, and I have no doubt about any of this research on circadian rhythms, but I think we're focusing on the wrong meal as the most important meal of the day. I think it's actually dinner that's the most important meal of the day from the perspective of that's the time when your metabolism is slower. So you should be more careful with what you do at dinner. And so there's been some really nice research out of Japan that have looked at breakfast skipping, and they found about half people who skip breakfast eat dinner at a normal time. And they don't have much higher risk of things like hypertension or type 2 diabetes or obesity. But people who skip breakfast and eat dinner late have much higher odds of the two. And so the way I think about it is if you skip breakfast and eat dinner at a normal time, you're technically doing time restricted eating. So you're going to get some of the benefits of the extended fasting period, even though you might be losing some of the benefits from eating earlier in the day. So you might still be able to come out ahead, meaning you probably still are getting benefits. And that's what we tend to see in the literature that if you do, if you skip breakfast and start eating at, 12 p.m. and then eat in an 8-hour window, I think you still come out ahead because you still are going to lose weight. You may not get as many benefits for blood sugar or blood pressure, but you're probably still coming out ahead. But if you're willing to eat earlier in the day and do the time restricted eating, that's probably where you get the most benefits. And that's some of the work we're doing in my lab right now. So we're actually testing early, what we call early versus late time restricted eating versus, eating 3 square meals throughout the day and trying to kind of conclusively find out, okay, um, if, for instance, you have to eat dinner at a certain time, should you spread your meals out throughout the day um, to take advantage of, your higher metabolism in the morning, or should you, skip breakfast, eat in a shorter time period? Um, so we're kind of putting this, to the test to know for certain. But if you were to ask me, if you were to say, what would you recommend my listeners do? If they're willing to eat an early dinner, that would be my top recommendation. So eat dinner early in the day. Now, not practical for a lot of people, but many
Can
people
you
could probably eat
specify
dinner.
what you mean
Yeah,
by early?
yeah, 5 or 6 p.m.
Okay.
Or if you're willing to do earlier, awesome. If you're not, don't worry about it. So if you're willing to do early time restricted eating, you're probably getting the most benefits. My lab and several other labs have found that eating early in the day lowers blood sugar, it lowers blood pressure, it reduces oxidative stress, which is just a form of molecular damage in the body. Now, I say that most people aren't willing to do it. We find that once people try it, far more people are willing to do it. So, there's also a little bit of a don't knock it till you try it. Um, that said, for most people, it's not practical. You have to eat dinner at a certain time of day. So, my second recommendation, if you're able to do it, is to eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. So that allows you to keep your current meal times, but still get a lot of the benefits. And there's been some really fantastic research on this over the last decade, especially from Israel, where they've tested that old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And they found that it helps people lose more weight. They are much less hungry while doing it. So they've also looked at those appetite hormones throughout the day, and they show, oh, wow, you definitely improve those appetite hormones. Um, and they've also found that it improves subjective experiences of hunger. So people are like, oh, yeah, I do feel less hungry. Um, and it even improves something called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So it actually helps with fertility. And this has been proven in a scientific study that when women were eating more of their calories earlier in the day, more women were able to actually conceive. So, which is amazing. And
Wow.
what's fascinating is we now know some of the same genes that produce these 24-hour rhythms in our body also produce rhythms that are longer and shorter than 24 hours, including rhythms in your menstrual cycle. So we now understand, like, if we can optimize our circadian rhythms, we can also improve fertility. We can also improve other aspects of our health. So, really, really cool research out there on this topic. So my second recommendation is, just keep your dinner at your normal time, right? Like I have a young family, I got young kids, I got a family too, so days that I don't do early time restricted eating, I still eat most of my food early in the day. I usually eat, 75% of my calories by about 12 or 1 p.m. every day. And it's pretty easy. You can make dinner your healthiest meal. It can be more of your veggies, your salad, your low calorie foods, and then kind of put some of your higher calorie foods early in the day. And then my third recommendation, if you can't do any of those two things, would be to do time restricted eating by skipping breakfast, and starting around 12. I would not try to skip breakfast and lunch. I know there are a number of people who do what's called OMAD, which is one meal a day, and usually they'll do that for dinner. Um, but we do have a little bit of concerns about losing muscle mass with that. But we don't have any sort of clear scientific evidence either way for or against one meal a day. But I am quite nervous about eating all your food during a time of day when your metabolism is slower. So those would be my top, three recommendations ranked. And I think you're still going to get benefits from skipping breakfast as long as you don't eat dinner too late and you focus on making dinner, a healthy meal.
I think that that is so sort of when I'm thinking about times in my life where I have been focused solely on calorie restriction as
Mm,
a means of, whatever I was doing in my 20s, it wasn't a good idea. But so much of the times where I can remember doing that was starting off really strong in the morning with like, I'm just going to eat, the least amount of calories and the healthiest that I possibly can for breakfast and lunch. And
yes.
then by the time I got to dinner, it was such a caloric deficit that I
Mhm.
was absolutely starving. I had no energy, and it was just like that's where it all fell apart. Was
That's
like 6 o'clock. Like it
yeah,
was just like way too much for dinner, and then continuing on with like I'm gonna have a snack before bed and all of this because of the extreme restriction
yeah,
throughout the whole first half of the day.
yeah,
And I think so many people have walked that road of like, I'm going to be perfect today. And they get to dinner and it's just like, or they eat dinner and then it's just like, here comes the ice cream because of all of the restriction during the day. So I really like this sort of putting that all in its head and saying, in actuality, we're going to eat the majority of our calories when we have the most time to use them
yes, yeah.
in the waking hours.
And there is data too that when you eat a little bit more earlier in the day, you tend to move more later in the day.
I mean, like, it just makes so much sense of all of this sort of restricting being early in the day. And that's when you need so much of your energy. And when you like come home and plop down and then taking in all of your calories at that time just
Yeah,
seems so backwards. But at the same time, that is just sort of diet culture.
that's right. That's right. Now, one interesting thing is some people might say, I'm just not hungry. I can't get myself to eat. And they're right. There are reasons why. So what we know is once you start adapting to a certain eating schedule, your body kind of like forces you to keep going on that schedule. It creates these changes. It kind of locks you into that schedule. So anytime you change your schedule, it's going to feel hard. And we've seen that in our studies, and some other people have reported that. But we've generally found the first 2 to 4 weeks are the hardest. But it gets better. So, for instance, there's something called Ramadan fasting. So, during the month of Ramadan, and the sort of Muslim tradition, people do what's called dry fasting during the day. So, meaning when the sun is out, they're drinking no water and eating no food. And what we find is after a month of people doing Ramadan, their hunger hormones start shifting to make them hungry at night. So your body starts adapting to whatever you do. Now, if you've been skipping breakfast for 20 years, it's going to be way harder for you to adapt to eating breakfast, earlier. But then you can start with other strategies. Like, why don't you make that first, you still have a breakfast or a first meal of the day. Why don't you start making that first meal of the day? Keep pushing more and more calories to that meal and then moving it a little bit earlier if that's something you want to do. But
Right.
just, take some of these strategies we talked about today and find a way to make them work. And it's okay that it won't necessarily be easy at first. Now, we should always talk about cons, or just like big picture perspective. So I do think what you eat probably matters more than when you eat. So I think diet quality probably matters more. We don't have 100% clear evidence, but one of my favorite studies that I will cite is Kevin Hall at the NIH did a study in ultra processed foods, and he found that they cause people to overeat by about 500 calories a day, which is massive. So when you look at the hierarchy, like when we have debates about high and low carb diets and what you should follow, number one principle, avoid, processed foods as much as possible. Most important thing you do. But, next on the hierarchy, I mean, intermittent fasting with about a 250 calorie reduction a day, I mean, that's middle of the road. So, whereas, our debates on whether high carb or low carb diets help you lose more weight, science is kind of like maybe it's about a 75 calorie difference a day. So that's much less than intermittent fasting. Now, that's just looking at weight loss, and we also have to care about other aspects of health. But in the scheme of things, it makes some of our debates on macronutrients look a little less big. So or a little less important. And I'm not saying they're not important, but if number one thing is not to eat processed foods and really to have a high quality diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, and so forth. And then a few other things that people should keep in mind. If you're pregnant, I don't recommend you do intermittent fasting. If you're breastfeeding, I don't recommend it. We don't know for certain it's bad, but we don't have clear evidence it's safe. So we don't, recommend it. And generally, when we think about intermittent fasting, it's kind of slowing down growth and causing sort of rejuvenation in the body, but it's slowing growth. So we don't want anyone who's in any sort of like rapid growing phase to eat it. So we generally don't recommend children to do intermittent fasting. We don't recommend women who are pregnant or breastfeeding from doing it. And then those who are on medications, if you're doing time restricted eating, we don't find that really increases the chances of low blood sugar, but you should still work with your doctor to be safe. But lots of other intermittent fasting approaches, the ones that are more extreme, for instance, where you sometimes eat one meal a day, those you absolutely need to work with your doctor on those, because we do find that increases the risk of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. And in fact, there are published recommendations in the literature for, cut this medication by 50% or this one by 70% to keep yourself safe. So definitely work with your doctor. So those are some common caveats. And then with shift workers, we're still as researchers trying to figure out what time of day they should eat.
I mean, they are too.
Such a
They're
hot topic.
they're trying to figure it out too.
Yep. So I think it's about 15 to 18% of the population either does overnight shift work or rotating shift work or crosses multiple time zones. The best data we have at the moment suggests they should probably eat during the daytime when the sun is out. But some of these studies are done in what are called simulated shift work populations, meaning people who don't routinely do shift work, who, you now bring into the study and then you do these tests on them. So we don't know for certain this is the best time of the day, but it's the sort of best evidence we have at the moment. But I'm hoping in the next 5 to 7 years, we'll have a clear answer on that topic too.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. But you got to know, we are able to bring you this incredible content each week and talk to you about all of the pressing matters in health and fitness because of our successful TTSL workout program.
We have incredible coaches, movement demos, and just different cycles all the time. So we take the thinking out of your training every day.
If you would like to join us, please go to ttsldaily.com and pick out your package. You are going to love every day of fitness. Lastly, I really want to hone in for a second on muscle loss because, we talk so often about weight loss being sort of the be all end all health goal, and, weight loss equals more health. And one of the things that we've really tried to push on our listeners is that when we're weighing ourselves, we're weighing a lot more than just our fat. We're not just made up of fat. So weight loss is a very, very individual, small scope of what is going on in your body. And just measuring health based on that alone is a really, really dangerous practice.
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking recently at some experts who are now exposing the fact that losing muscle is actually far more dangerous to the human body than gaining body fat. And I want to let you sort of get into intermittent fasting with the caveat of, are we going to be able to continue to gain and maintain our muscle mass, which is now being shown as, so first of all, in
Mhm.
your metabolism, like the benefits are, we've gone over this again and again. But also just your longevity. Muscle mass is the key to longevity. And I want to give you an opportunity to tell people how to incorporate this without potentially doing damage to their muscle mass.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So, and one fun fact about muscle mass too, in the last year, we found out actually it's better for improving skin health and skin quality than aerobic exercise. So, some nice benefits there for strength training. So, absolutely everything you said is true. And in fact, we find roughly a quarter of people are skinny fat. So if you only measured their body weight, you'd think they're doing great, but they're really sort of under muscled. Is the term we might use. So for intermittent fasting, for types of intermittent fasting other than time restricted eating, we don't have a lot of data. Um, in part because some of these intermittent fasting approaches are more extreme. But there was a study out of the UK in the past 2 years that did find that fasting for 36 hours repeatedly does cause too much loss of lean mass, what we call lean mass, but it's essentially muscle mass. So I don't recommend most of these more extreme versions of intermittent fasting. I'm actually pretty conservative. Yes, if you're undergoing cancer treatment, I think the fasting mimicking diet is great. But as a repeated long term practice of multiple days in a row of eating a very low calorie diet, I would rather someone use classic calorie restriction, cut their calories by less, and just get to their goal weight in a sustainable way. And for those of you out there who are like, I struggle with weight loss, I don't find it easy either, if that helps. And I'm an obesity researcher. My sweet spot is losing about half a pound a week, which a lot of people might laugh at, but that's how I get it done after having kids. But back to the
The
point of
long game. It's
muscle.
the
Yeah,
long
it's
game.
the long game. It's 100% the long game and what you can sustain. Um, Now, when anytime anyone loses weight, roughly about a quarter of that will be muscle, and the other three quarters will be fat. But it's quite variable. And if you strength train, you can make much more of that fat. And for those who are really aggressively strength training, nearly all of that can come from fat, which is amazing. So, huge benefits there. Now, the research on time restricted eating, the good news is it looks like it doesn't help or hinder any sort of muscle building efforts there. So there have been a number of studies, including by Grant Tinsley at Texas Tech, and he has found that generally you can put on muscle just as well, and that there are no negative effects on strength, muscle cross sectional area, or any of the other metrics that we would use. Sort of like, I think there's a one rep maximum is one of the metrics that they'll use for a lot of sort of strength training exercises. So we don't actually see any negative effects on your ability to build muscle, whether we're looking at sort of like the output or the size of the muscle per se. So that's great news. Now, all this research has been for 8-hour time restricted eating. I can't say the same would be true for OMAD, one meal a day. So I generally don't recommend that, but I think if you're in a 6 to 10 hour window, you should be fine from a muscle building perspective. I still don't recommend necessarily doing 2 meals a day because there are limits on how much protein you absorb in each meal. So I would still recommend at least 3 meals a day, even if you're doing a 6-hour window. So those would be the only sort of caveats here. But the good news is we don't see any negative effects on muscle. And I think my lab actually has the largest collection of, well, we used to have, I think we finally got surpassed, but the largest collection of DEXA data actually testing this out. And we found no negative effects on muscle mass, which is good.
That's fantastic. I, you know, I just, I really love using this as sort of a, maybe not the be all end all, right? This isn't the no, the only answer, but using this as, never, your body is never in a vacuum. It's never one thing. It's never an all or nothing approach. It is a part of a really large system of
Mhm.
wellness that includes, as you said, working with the weights. You got to
Yep.
lift them weights,
Yeah.
and really being mindful about what is going in,
Mhm.
and then being mindful about when it's going in, and this sort of all working together. And I
Correct.
think that that's just such a refreshing point of view,
Yes.
because it's never really been one thing.
No, no, and I don't think intermittent fasting or strategically timing your meals solves all problems. I think you, exactly like you said, you have to focus on all these things. And for your listeners who are like, I just can't take one more thing, don't sweat it. Just generally remember, try to make dinner a healthier meal, because that's the time when your metabolism is slower. But other than that, if most of your listeners just focused on diet quality and make dinner the healthiest meal, like, awesome, that's going to get you most of the way there, is my guess.
I love that. I love simplifying it, and I love the fact that you're just such a wealth of knowledge on all of the studies that we're currently doing and that we have done, that
Yes.
are just optimizing. We can optimize. We can do this a little better. And if we can do it
Yeah.
1% better or 5% better, then why wouldn't we?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh, one more thought on sustainability. We're working on a paper on this right now, but we did a bunch of exit interviews when we had in one of our last studies. And the really interesting thing we found is there's no one size fits all in terms of how many days a week people should do this. So we found that some of our participants wanted to do it 7 days a week all the time, which is interesting. They didn't want the break day. And the reason why is they felt like when they had a break day, they would fall off the wagon and struggle to get back on. But then we had other folks who were like, oh, I want one break day a week or two break days a week, because I really need that social time with friends. So I think it's important just to think like there is no one size fits all. Go home, go experiment with, whatever approach you want to life, and then try to follow whatever you're doing 5 to 7 days a week, and then just keep tweaking and find out what works for you. There's not like a single one right answer. So that was really interesting for us because we weren't sure what people were going to say. And it kind of surprised us that some people are like, I want to do this all the time. And other people are like, I want to do it a little less often, but I can still do it, 5 days a week, so.
I'm so glad you said that, because all of my assumptions were just like that. That's just must be how I would have exit interviewed, that you just do this. This is your
Yeah,
life now. Here you go. Like, but I didn't think of sort of like, well, what about, this late night with friends, and it's
right,
the Super Bowl. I don't know. It's just like these things
right.
that come up.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, I don't go out to eat frequently because I have young kids. But every time I do, I just do what everyone else is doing, and then just try to eat healthy. Like, I just don't sweat it, right? Because I'm going
Right.
to go out to eat 1 to 3 times a month max. So I just do what everyone else is doing, and if that works for you, awesome, more power to you. But I think we've now, at least certainly, we now believe there's no one right answer for everyone. And this goes back to the behavioral piece, right? So, I mean, we talked a lot about the metabolic piece because it's fascinating, but at the end of the day, we find behavior is just so important. And when we try to predict who's going to be successful in our studies, we've done all kinds of fancy math. And at the end of the day, when people's chronotype, whether they're a morning bird or night owl, doesn't predict how well they'll do with the early time restricted eating. It's all behavior. And the people we find who are most successful are the ones who have a consistent routine or schedule, who prep their food, who set reminders for when to eat, and who have good, social and family support. Like, those are the folks who can knock this out of the park. Now, some small fraction of people who just, you have a relative who becomes ill and you just can't get around that. But life goes in phases, and you can pick different approaches for different phases in your life, whatever works for you right then and now. So one thing that's nice to know is you're never stuck where you currently are. And also, if you need to flex things, flex things.
What great advice. What amazing advice. And, the other benefit about going out to eat at 5 o'clock is there's nobody there. I know because that's the only time I'll bring my kid
Yeah,
because there's no one there for him to bother.
yeah,
So it's great. You don't have to wait for a
yeah,
table. Like it's
yeah,
just like, it's
yeah.
totally dead.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I don't tend to go out to eat that early. I mean, I just do what everyone else is doing, so you don't have to. But if you want to, I mean, there are benefits. You can hear people across the table better.
I want to give you an opportunity to let our listeners know where they can hear more from you.
Oh gosh, I probably at some point will have a social media presence, but I don't at the moment. Um, but I'm
It's
at the
probably for the best. It's
once I get things, we have such a large lab, so many studies going on. I just, to be honest, can't manage it all. But in the long term, I certainly care a lot about getting more of this information out. Um, Sadly, you can probably only find me at my faculty webpage at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. But I would hope, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years that, I might have a, small YouTube channel or newsletter or something fun just to let people know about the latest science.
excellent, Courtney. Well, thank you again for all of your expertise, for all of your work in the field, and just genuinely dedicating your services to helping people to live better and longer. It's really commendable.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, it's so great to be able to help people.